have no great professional expertise in the field of vocations. I've never been a vocations director, and yet I'm confident that I, like all of us, have a vocation. I understand my ministry as a bishop and priest to be a response to the particular call that God in His mercy has extended to me. I also have had the opportunity now to work closely with vocation directors in 4 dioceses, 3 as bishop. I obviously can't hold a job. And I also have had the privilege of working with seminarians in spiritual direction for many years. First at St. Paul's Seminary in Pittsburgh, and then again at the North American College. I also served for almost a decade as a confessor for postulants in a women's religious community, and in that capacity came to know a great deal about the process of discernment in consecrated life. My reflections today come from those experiences. I didn't really appreciate who was going to be here at this seminar until Dolores sent me the attendance list just last week, and I can tell you my knees have been shaking ever since, because it's a little bit like the general practitioner speaking about brain surgery to brain surgeons. But I hope that you'll bear with me. The theme for your gathering this year, the Year of Mercy, Leadership, Mission, and Vocations, certainly intrigued me. I would like to address the Year of Mercy's connection to all 3 of those elements, but would prefer to do it in reverse order, speaking first about vocations, then about mission, and then about leadership. I hope that won't derail the thought process too much. Please allow me to begin by speaking a little bit about Pope Francis and the Year of Mercy, just background. In the first year of his pontificate, Pope Francis presided at something that he called 24 Hours for the Lord. It was a penance service at St. Peter's on the Friday before the 4th Sunday of Lent. Most of us will remember it because of the powerful photo of Pope Francis himself going to confession, before heading into the confessional to hear confessions. The following year, on March 13, 2015, Pope Francis once again kicked off the 24 Hours with the Lord as he had the previous year. This time, however, about 4/5 of the way through his short homily, he surprised the world by calling for a year of mercy, an extraordinary jubilee that would focus on God's mercy that would begin in just 9 months from the date, while the year of consecrated life would still be in full swing. It took the world by surprise, and no one knew quite what to expect. There certainly weren't many details. A month later, the details began to arrive. Just before celebrating First Vespers of the Feast of Divine Mercy, he issued the bull that would formally initiate the year, Misericordiae Vultus, the face of mercy. In his homily at Vespers that evening, the Pope seems to have addressed the big question mark. He said this: "Many question in their hearts, why a jubilee of mercy today?" There were bishops asking that question all over the world. Simply because the Church, in this time of great historical change, is called to offer more evident signs of God's presence and closeness. Pope Francis made it clear that this would be, and I quote, "a holy year to experience strongly within ourselves the joy of having been found by Jesus the Good Shepherd, who has come in search of us because we were lost. A jubilee to receive the warmth of his love when he bears us upon his shoulders and brings us back to the Father's house. A year in which to be touched by the Lord Jesus and to be transformed by his mercy, so that we may become witnesses to mercy." Here then, Francis said, is the reason for the Jubilee, because this is the time for mercy. It is the favorable time to heal wounds, a time not to be weary of meeting all those who are waiting to see and to touch with their hands the signs of the closeness of God, a time to offer everyone, the way of forgiveness and reconciliation. While the Pope had clearly managed to catch the Catholic world by surprise, we probably should not have been. He had been talking about mercy from the beginning of his pontificate. I happened to be in St. Peter's Square on the first Sunday after his election. So for the first Sunday noontime Angelus, I was there with 100,000 of his closest friends. All of Rome had come out to see and hear the new Pope, to see what would be his first words to the world. You'll recall that this was even before the Mass beginning his pontificate. If you remember what he spoke about that Sunday at the Angelus, it was mercy. He began by quoting a book that he had just read, a book by Cardinal Casper on, you guessed it, mercy. I had studied in Rome and worked in Rome long enough to know that popes only quoted other popes or folks whose name began with saint. You might get away with citing someone like Dante or Manzoni or Shakespeare, but a living cardinal, never. We should have known from the get-go that Pope Francis wasn't going to feel bound by protocol. He proceeded to tell a story about mercy from his days at the beginning of his time in Buenos Aires. He spoke of how he had gone to a huge celebration where he was hearing confessions, but he had to escape to go to a confirmation. I was so relieved to hear that I wasn't the only one who double-booked sometimes. As he was heading out of the confessional, or the place where he was hearing confessions, he was stopped by an old woman and assumed that she wanted to go to confession. His exchange with her was very beautiful, but it concluded with the Pope asking her how she knew that God always forgives sins. And the woman stated that if God didn't forgive, the world wouldn't exist. At which point in the Angelus, the Pope made a crack about the woman not having studied at the Gregorian University. I can tell you, people didn't know if they could laugh or not. You don't normally laugh at the papal Angelus. You do now. He went on, however, to say something, twice in fact, that we have heard throughout his pontificate. Remember, this is the first Sunday Angelus. He says this: we have a God who never tires of offering mercy, of forgiving, but we sometimes tire of asking for it. So you may ask, how does this tie into vocations? There's certainly a strong connection in the mind of Pope Francis. At the time that he was named the bishop in Argentina, and then again when he was named successor of Peter, he chose for his motto a Latin phrase taken from a commentary of the Venerable Bede describing the call of St. Matthew. Miserando atque eligendo. It's not the easiest phrase to translate. In the Office of Readings for the Feast of St. Matthew, we find that text from Venerable Bede, and it's translated as, because he saw him through the eyes of mercy and chose him. That's a little awkward as a translation of two Latin gerunds, miserando and eligendo. But what's clear is that the motto ties together two actions on the part of the Lord, having mercy and choosing. In the case of St. Matthew, the Venerable Bede sees the call as being integrally linked to the Lord's mercy. Austin Ivory, in his insightful book on Pope Francis, the Great Reformer, notes that Pope Francis loved the way that the Latin language had mercy as a verb, miserando. And then he proceeded to make up his own Spanish word to attempt to create that sense, misericordando, to describe an activity of the divine, something that God does to you. I finally seen somebody try to do that in English, and they said mercified. Huh? You get the idea, huh? Dejate misericordiar, he would tell the guilt-ridden and scrupulous. Let yourself be mercied. You might recall the portion of the interview that Pope Francis gave with Father Spadaro, the editor of the Jesuit publication Civiltà Cattolica, not long into his pontificate. That was a little bit interesting as well, the Pope giving interviews. But he spoke not only about his motto, but in a related way about the Caravaggio painting that captures the very moment of the call of St. Matthew. When Spadaro asked Pope Francis the question, just who is Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the Pope responded, I do not know what might be the most fitting description. And then eventually he said, I am a sinner. Proceeded, this is the most accurate definition. It is not a figure of speech, a literary genre. I am a sinner. I am a sinner whom the Lord has looked upon. I am the one who was looked upon by the Lord. I always felt my motto, miserando atque eligendo, was very true for me. In reference to the Caravaggio painting, he said, that finger of Jesus pointing at Matthew, that's me. I feel like him, like Matthew. Spadaro notes that here the Pope became determined, as if he had finally found the image he was looking for. The Pope said, it is the gesture of Matthew that strikes me. He holds on to his money as if to say, no, not me. No, this money is mine. Here, this is me, a sinner on whom the Lord has turned his gaze. It's clear for Pope Francis that that gaze, that loving gaze, is a gaze of mercy. That connection to St. Matthew and to an appreciation of the connection between mercy and vocation goes much deeper for Pope Francis. He often tells the story of a providential confession that he made as a 16-year-old, you guessed it, on the feast of St. Matthew, September 21st, 1953. In Argentina, he notes, September 21st is not the first day of fall as it is for us, but it's the first day of spring. And it was a special holiday for young people, for students, called Students' Day. He reminisces often that he felt the impulse as he was going out that day to start the celebration by going to pray at his parish church, which would not have been all that exceptional or surprising for the young Jorge Mario. But when he was at the church, and it's the church he passed all the time, he saw a priest he didn't know, and even though it wasn't part of his plan that day, he felt the urge to confess to that priest. He says that he doesn't remember the details of the confession. I was thinking, oh, sure he doesn't. But what he remembers is that it was in the context of that confession, of that experience of God's mercy, that he first knew that the Lord was calling him to be a priest. And as he put it, he knew that he had to be a priest. He was so overwhelmed by the experience that he went home rather than going out with his friends. It was such a powerful experience that whenever he would return to that church, once he became the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, he would make a point of kissing the grill of that confessional. That's how important that experience was for Pope Francis. I found myself in St. Peter's Square on the Vigil of Pentecost in 2013. And Pope Francis was meeting that evening with members of ecclesial movements. And he engaged with the young members of those movements in a question and answer session. Pretty interesting. And it was still that time where he was doing almost everything off the cuff. Rather than paraphrasing his comments, indulge me as I share with you the official translation of his comments that evening, just a portion of those comments. And it's about that confession. He said, after making my confession, I felt something had changed. I was not the same. I had heard something like a voice or a call. I was convinced that I should become a priest. This experience of faith is important. We sing we must seek God, go to him, and ask forgiveness. But when we go, he is waiting for us. He is there first. In Spanish, the Pope said, we have a word that explains this well. Primeriar. The Lord always gets there before us. He gets there first. He's waiting for us. To find someone waiting for you is truly a great grace. You go to him as a sinner, but he is waiting to forgive you. This is the experience that the prophets of Israel describe, comparing the Lord to an almond blossom, the first flower of spring. Before any other flowers appear, he is there waiting. The Lord is waiting for us. Moreover, when we seek him, we discover that he is waiting to welcome us, to offer us his love. And this fills your heart with such wonder that you can hardly believe it. And this is how your faith grows, through encounter with a person, through encounter with the Lord. Some people will say, no, I prefer to read about faith in books. It is important to read about faith, but look, on its own, this is not enough. What is important is our encounter with Jesus, our encounter with him. And this is what gives you faith, because he is the one who gives it to you. The mechanics of the connection in the mind of Pope Francis between the between the experience of mercy and vocation isn't completely clear to me. I'm not sure if the experience of mercy helps the heart to recognize the call, or if it helps the heart to recognize what it desires, or it helps the heart to say yes. I have a feeling that it's probably all three of the above. Ivory quotes Bergoglio as describing a vocation as a call from God to a heart which is expecting that call, either consciously or unconsciously. Let me give you that one again. Vocation is a call from God to a heart which is expecting that call, either consciously or unconsciously. Pope Francis has made it very clear, however, that it was his knowledge of God's mercy that gave him the strength to say yes, to accept his election as successor of St. Peter. So while it might not have been clear when he was 16, that connection was surely clear at the time of his election. In that same interview with Father Spadaro that I had mentioned above, the Pope shared his response when asked if he would accept his election. Pardon me, my Latin's even worse than my Spanish. But this is what the Pope said, and he says it always in Latin, so I'll offer you the same. Peccator sum, sed super misericordia et infinita patientia Domini nostri Iesu Christi confisus et in spiritu penitentiae excepto. I am a sinner, but I trust in the infinite mercy and patience of our Lord Jesus Christ, and I accept in a spirit of penance. So it's that trust that Francis has in God's mercy, God's patience, that gives him the courage to respond now to a very distinct call, a very distinct vocation. For Pope Francis, his vocational strength seems to come from his personal experience of God's love in spite of his sinfulness, in spite of his identity as a sinner. How often does the Pope speak of himself as a sinner? I was present at an audience in October that year when he was speaking of the holiness of the church and noted that the church was holy even though there were men who were sinners, women who were sinners, priests who were sinners, bishops who were sinners, cardinals who were sinners. I was so happy he had skipped over archbishops. But then he ended that whole litany with, and a pope who is a sinner. As he pronounced the words, Papa Peccatore, the crowd went wild. I can't imagine that they were applauding because the Pope sins. But rather, I suspect they were applauding because we have a Pope who is humble enough to admit publicly that he is a sinner. Pope Francis, in speaking about the year of mercy, repeatedly notes that that sense of our sinfulness, of our weakness, when twinned with the knowledge that God can transform our sinful hearts, changes everything. So what are the implications of that for vocations ministry? I would say that you can look at it in two different ways. The first is kind of a remote or an indirect impact, and the second would be more direct and proximate. As for the remote or indirect, I think that the Pope's experience and what he's teaching us, certainly in this year of mercy, is the importance of encouraging our youth and young adult ministries to include opportunities for celebrating God's mercy, both sacramental and non-sacramental. Anything that we can do as a church to get our young people to recall God's mercy in their lives is going to bear fruit, whatever their vocation might be. That's certainly true in the year of mercy, but I think it has much greater applicability as well. The Jesuit spiritual writer George Aschenbrenner, one of the original forces behind the now famous Institute of Priestly Formation, IPF, did a great bit of writing and speaking in the 80s and early 90s about an understanding of the traditional examination of conscience that allowed it to become more of an examination of consciousness. It wasn't just looking at our sins, but it was looking at every way in which the Lord had been present to us in the course of the day. I would think that a daily mercy check might be a great habit to instill in our young people. That's the indirect or the remote. What about direct? Certainly many applications for seminaries or priestly formation programs or institutes of consecrated life require a sort of spiritual autobiography on the part of the applicant. As a prelude, perhaps it would be helpful to direct the interested individual to write a history of God's mercy in his or her life, to guide an aspirant or applicant in getting in touch with the many ways the Lord has shown his tender mercy to him or to her. That could be part of the pre-marriage preparation as well. As part of that process, the young person who is inquiring about a vocation would probably also benefit from a targeted sharing of stories of those whose lives have been changed by God's mercy. You think, for example, of Augustine, or Thomas Merton, or Dorothy Day, all figures that the Pope has spoken about. But how helpful that would be in that process of engaging with an applicant or an aspirant to help them to target, in a way, their reading, to hear about those great figures. In assessing the likelihood that the Lord is calling a person to consecrated life, or to the permanent diaconate, or to priesthood, a vocations director might also do well to begin to understand the applicant's understanding of God. Does he or she see God as being merciful, or is there some other predominant perspective that dominates that relationship? I would think that this would be a particularly fruitful dialogue in determining the candidate's understanding of his or her vocation. Is there a sense that the call is coming as the Lord looks with the eyes of mercy, or is there some other dynamic at work? A few years back, there was a young priest who left ministry just a few weeks after his ordination. And as we tried to assess what had gone wrong, a priest came forward and mentioned that at the reception, the night before the ordination, this young man, about to be ordained the next day, pulled the priest aside, never had met him, had no relationship with the guy, but just started speaking to him about how God had cursed him with a vocation. That the vocation was a curse. He wanted to do it. He wanted out of nobility to respond. But he had this great sense that it was because of his sins in the past that God was asking him to do this. We needed to have those kinds of discussions a lot earlier than the night before ordination. But I find that as I speak about that a little bit, that there are plenty of people that have that experience. That man wasn't alone, maybe to the extent. But we have to really figure out, does somebody have a sense that God's call is connected to that loving gaze of mercy or not. Certainly, psychologists assisting in the work of discernment might be encouraged to explore the candidate's capacity for receiving mercy as well. Certainly, what Pope Francis would be telling us is that it's that ability to receive mercy that then is the fire, is the energy that helps us as we go forward to share mercy. So we have to be able to receive. Enough about vocation. How about mission? Any genuine vocation in the church has to be tied to the church's overarching mission. And that mission, as Francis tells us, is a mission of mercy. In calling for the year of mercy, Pope Francis has reminded us, underlined for us, that the mission of the church always has to be mercy. As he states in paragraph number 12 of the bull, the church is commissioned to announce the mercy of God, the beating heart of the gospel, which in its own way must penetrate the heart and mind of every person. The spouse of Christ must pattern her behavior after the Son of God, who went out to everyone without exception. Notice that the Pope's speaking in the imperative. This isn't an option. It's our mission. It's our obligation. It's what we were commissioned to do by Christ himself. If we don't embrace that aspect of our charge, we're not imitating the all-merciful Christ, and we're necessarily off mission. Pope Francis states that mercy is the very foundation of the church's life. All of her pastoral activity should be caught up in the tenderness she makes present to believers. Nothing in her preaching and in her witness to the world can be lacking in mercy. The church's very credibility is seen in how she shows merciful and compassionate love. In tying mercy so closely to the church's core mission, Pope Francis is speaking about the unchanging nature of the church. Her mission was one of mercy when the Lord sent out the 12, and it's mercy now. As the Holy Father characterizes it, the church has an endless desire to show mercy. That being said, however, Pope Francis is very conscious of this being the opportune moment for a reboot. Looking out at the contemporary world, he posits that the time has come for the church to take up the joyful call to mercy once more. As he puts it, it's a time to return to the basics and to bear the weaknesses and struggles of our brothers and sisters. Mercy is the force that reawakens us to new life and instills in us the courage to look to the future with hope. It's endless and ageless, but now is surely a critical moment. It's a moment when mercy has seemed to lose its emphasis in the world. The Holy Father is rather blunt in describing the status quo. He says, we must admit that the practice of mercy is waning in the wider culture. In some cases, the word seems to have dropped out of use. However, without a witness to mercy, life becomes fruitless and sterile, as if sequestered in a barren desert. From the Holy Father's perspective, the theme of mercy needs to be proposed again and again with new enthusiasm and renewed pastoral action. It is absolutely essential for the Church and for the credibility of her message that she herself live and testify to mercy. Her language and her gestures must transmit mercy so as to touch the hearts of all people and inspire them once more to find the road that leads to the Father. That witness to mercy has to be concrete. In Pope Francis's way of looking at things, mercy isn't a feeling, it's an action. Remember what I mentioned earlier about the Holy Father creating one of his Bergogliisms to make mercy into a verb. He gives us a game plan for offering that kind of concrete witness, and it revolves around the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. They are not thoughts of mercy or dreams for mercy, but they're works of mercy. And for the Holy Father, those works are the benchmark for determining whether or not we are living as Christ's disciples, pure and simple, In number 16 of the bull, he encourages us to use the Jubilee year to rediscover these corporal works of mercy, to feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, clothe the naked, welcome the stranger, heal the sick, visit the imprisoned, and bury the dead. And to make sure that we do not forget the spiritual works of mercy, to counsel the doubtful, instruct the ignorant, admonish sinners, comfort the afflicted, forgive offenses, bear patiently those who do us ill, and pray for the living and the dead. Throughout this year, the Holy Father has been often referring to that famous passage from the 25th chapter of St. Matthew, and the need to feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, welcome the stranger, clothe the naked, and spend time with the sick and those in prison. In fact, in the bull he states that, this is a little bit long, so bear with me, we cannot escape the Lord's words to us, and they will serve as the criteria upon which we will be judged. Moreover, we will be asked if we have helped others to escape the doubt that causes them to fall into despair, and which is often a source of loneliness. If we have helped to overcome the ignorance in which millions of people live, especially children deprived of the necessary means to free them from the bonds of poverty. If we have been close to the lonely and afflicted, if we have forgiven those who have offended us and have rejected all forms of anger and hate that lead to violence, if we have had the kind of patience God shows, who is so patient with us, and if we have commended our brothers and sisters to the Lord in prayer. In each of these little ones, Christ himself is present. His flesh becomes visible in the flesh of the tortured, the crushed, the scourged, the malnourished, and the exiled, to be acknowledged, touched, and cared by us. So what impact does this understanding of the Church's mission have on those of us who are gathered here? Excuse me, that talk about quenching the thirst of the thirsty reminds me. So what is that impact? First of all, I think that we need to be able to articulate our vocation, whatever it might be, in terms of that overarching mission. Obviously, not every vocation has an active apostolate that cares for the needy in a physical way. But every vocation provides opportunity for the spiritual and corporal works of mercy. If there's any human interaction at all, there are opportunities for mercy. Pope Francis so often uses the image of the church being a field hospital. In his interview with Father Spadaro, he had this to say: "The thing the church needs most today is the ability to heal wounds and to warm the hearts of the faithful. It needs nearness, proximity. I see the church as a field hospital after battle. It is useless to ask a seriously injured person if he has high cholesterol or about the level of his blood sugars. You have to heal his wounds. Then we can talk about everything else. Heal the wounds. Heal the wounds. And you have to start from the ground up." Now, we all know that there are many wards in that field hospital. We know that a hospital needs all kinds of staffing, doing all kinds of different activities, but all in support of the overall goal of healing. Likewise, in the church, each vocation has to be support for the field hospital's overall goal of bringing healing, without necessarily duplicating what the others are doing. But each of us has to be able to articulate what it is that we are doing to promote the overall goal. Obviously, a hermit is going to have a different role to play than the Little Sisters of the Poor, but all have to be committed to supporting the goal of healing and the works of mercy in whichever context, on whichever vocational path they find themselves. The Year of Mercy gives all of us an opportunity to take stock of what we're doing and why. If mercy is at the heart of the Church's mission, we have to be looking for women and men who are committed to that mission, who aren't afraid of confronting the mess, the chaos of human existence. In the main quad at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, just down the street from where I've been living, there's an impressive bronze statue of my predecessor, Archbishop John Ireland. He's wearing the frock coat of his day, and from a distance, he looks like any other gentleman, or at least any other gentleman bishop of his day. Yet when you draw closer to the statue, you realize that he is wearing muddied shoes and wrinkled trousers that a working man would wear. He wasn't afraid of confronting the muck of his life. Interestingly, it was his sister, Sister Seraphine Ireland, who founded the women's college a mile down the road, St. Catherine's, affectionately known as St. Kate's. From what I have read of Sister Seraphine, she certainly wasn't afraid of confronting the chaos and confusion of real life either. Indeed, if the same artist were to be commissioned to do a bronze of Sister Seraphine, I suspect she might be wearing not only muddied shoes, but hip waders. We need to be searching for and encouraging vocations of that sort. Men and women who are committed to addressing real human needs, whether it be through teaching, whether it be through parish ministry, whether it be through healthcare, or through contemplative prayer. On the last point, I had the privilege in the last two dioceses that I served of having communities of contemplative women, Carmelites in one, Dominicans in the other. And I can say that never have I seen more compassionate responses to human need than what I experienced in those monasteries. The Year of Mercy is an opportunity for all of us to respond to the mercy that God showers upon us daily by doing the same for others, for mirroring God's mercy, radiating God's love, regardless of our vocation. In many ways, the archetype in this regard is the Good Samaritan, one of the key figures in the Year of Mercy. As Pope Francis mentioned earlier this summer, we are all called to follow the same path of the Good Samaritan, who indeed is the figure of Christ. Jesus bent down to us. He became our servant, and thus he has saved us, so that we too might love as he loved us in the same way. The Pope finds very significant Jesus' command, go and do the same. Jesus is requiring action. In whatever setting we find ourselves, whatever is our vocation, we're being called to action, even if it's a contemplative life. Our vocation certainly shouldn't be an excuse for not acting, like the priest or the Levite in the parable. As we help our brothers and sisters discern their vocations, or as we promote vocational discernment, we have to help them see that a vocation is not a way of avoiding action, for avoiding encounters with the messiness of life, but rather a way of developing a sensitivity to how and why the Lord is calling us to serve our brothers and sisters in need. Many of you know far better than I the importance of a service component to vocational discernment. How many of our discerners first heard the Lord speak to their heart while they were on a mission trip, or serving at a homeless shelter, or soup kitchen, or teaching inner city kids to read. How often it's then that the Lord whispers into the heart, or that the Lord gives a glimpse of the big picture with a vision of a role that we can play. Up until I moved to the Twin Cities last May, I was living on the campus of Seton Hall University. There I was amazed by the generosity of the students who lived in my dorm, and really throughout the campus, who responded so eagerly to invitations to become involved in service projects. At the activities fair that they would have at the beginning of each semester, always the first activities to be filled were those related to mission trips and service. Counter to popular opinion, there is great magnanimity among our young people, and I was always amazed by how many of those young people began to really grapple with the big questions of the meaning of life as a result of an experience of service. I'm optimistic that the Year of Mercy's emphasis on the corporal and spiritual works of mercy is going to bear great vocational fruit. I would be interested in your experiences as well concerning how those very works of mercy can help a person struggling with discernment come more easily to a decision. You know the type. It's the young man in third theology who still can't decide what the Lord wants him to do. Should he marry? Should he be a priest? Or the young woman in novitiate who can't decide if she should take vows. Some years ago, at a meeting of spiritual directors in Rome, a wise Jesuit suggested that the best advice for that struggling discerner isn't to spend more time before Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament, but more time before Jesus present in those who are suffering and in need. I was a little skeptical at first, but when I heard the other spiritual directors sharing similar stories, I knew there was something to it. The interaction with the dying or the destitute has a way of touching the heart in a new way. In the Year of Mercy retreat that Pope Francis offered to priests earlier this year, he relayed that a priest had told him about a man who unexpectedly found himself homeless and was miserable. As the Pope tells the story, the man was, I quote, consumed by bitterness and did not interact with others. He was an educated person, as they later found out. Sometime thereafter, this man was hospitalized for a terminal illness. He told the priest that while he was there, feeling empty and disillusioned, the man in the next bed asked him to remove his bedpan and empty it. That request from someone truly in need, someone worse off than he was, opened his eyes and his heart to a powerful sense of humanity, a desire to help another person and to let himself be helped by God. A simple act of mercy put him in touch with infinite mercy. It led him to help someone else, and in doing so, to be helped himself. He died after making a good confession and at peace. I know that many of our brothers and sisters in consecrated life, for example, have already had that intuition. In the many years that I was working in Rome, where so many religious gather for their chapters, I was always impressed by how many communities insisted that the participants in the chapter undertake charitable work with Rome's poor, and most especially at the time that the decision-making at the chapter would be most intense. That merciful hands-on contact with the poor has a way of bringing us back to our vocation and back to our mission. We've spoken about vocation, spoken about mission. What about leadership? Please allow me to offer just a few reflections. The question of leadership in the Year of Mercy is certainly relevant because all of you are leaders in this area of vocations promotion and awareness. And also because the work that we do at its essence is helping people to discern how it is that the Lord is calling him or her to lead and to be leaders. I don't think that it's an overstatement to say that we're all called to leadership. The Catholic Leadership Institute, for example, begins its Good Leaders, Good Shepherds program from the premise that we are all called to exercise leadership at least over ourselves. For us as Catholics, our paradigm for leadership has to be Jesus himself. The apostles knew that. Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of everlasting life. If we're looking for leaders to follow, we need to discern those leaders who have aligned themselves with the mission of Christ, the Good Shepherd, and his church. That certainly requires a knowledge of Christ and his church that can only come from prayer, from study, from a life of encountering Christ in service. Likewise, if it is Christ who has given us a share in his mercy, we should be striving as leaders to model ourselves after Christ. And once again, that requires that prayer, that study, that sacramental life, and that service. While we are inspired to lead as Christ led, it is often helpful to look for more contemporary examples of leadership. For those in consecrated life, they often look to their founder or foundress as the model of leadership. For many of those of us not in consecrated life, we're blessed with an incredible and challenging model in Pope Francis. I'm floored by the number of articles that have appeared about Francis's leadership style, whether it be Forbes or the Wall Street Journals or the Harvard Business School or Time, you name it, they've written about him and his exercise of leadership. An Irish commentator went so far as to say, other leaders wishing to learn lessons in how to rebuild trust should watch carefully the approach of the new pontiff. The Wall Street Journal said, he may not have an MBA, but Pope Francis can teach you a thing or two about running a business. And The Economist dubbed him a turnaround artist on the level of Apple's Steve Jobs. What is it about his leadership that has captured the attention of these leadership experts? And I think they're all tied to the Year of Mercy. First of all, they've all pointed out and remarked on his humility, his awareness of his limitations, and his ability to enter into self-criticism. They are very closely allied to the process of honest self-examination that Pope Francis has made a foundation for this Year of Mercy. He's calling all of us to do that in humility, to have that sense of our limitations, to be willing to engage in that process of self-criticism. We've already spoken a little bit about Pope Francis's sense of humility. We all remember that powerful scene of Pope Francis going to confession, or as I shared the story about the Papa Peccatore, the Pope who's the sinner. Leadership gurus in the secular context tell us how important it is that leaders don't allow failures to get them down. We have to recognize that sometimes we err, sometimes we falter. That awareness of limitations can lead to two things: a willingness to delegate and an openness to consultation. We see both in Pope Francis. In that same interview with Spadaro, he spoke of his leadership as a Jesuit provincial. And he's looking back and seeing all the failures. He said he made decisions abruptly and by himself. Now he entrusts to others and really entrusts. He said that he or she, the people to whom he's delegating, must make a really big mistake before I rebuke that person. As for consultations, in that same interview, he said that I do not want token consultations, but real consultations. The use of experts, the use of teams, the involvement of people who are very different from the Pope, whether that be by their personality or their theology, even the choice of where he resides and eats, speaks of a desire to not be out of touch. That was certainly his reputation in Buenos Aires. You'll remember that he was famous for taking public transportation. I took the Green Line in St. Paul once. I don't think I'll do that again. John Ryan, one of those secular commentators on leadership styles, said this: great leaders understand their role is to facilitate the development of the talents of each and every group member, and to create a group that performs better than the sum of its parts, but rather benefits from the synergy of its combined talents developed through collaboration. I was happy to see that that's one of the topics on your agenda for later in the day, is to explore those ways for collaboration. So that's already an important part of your work, your ministry. Others have spoken of the importance of Francis's vulnerability, how he's willing to shun the security and safety, for example, of the bulletproof Pope-mobile. He's not afraid to be in contact with others. Even as that we were speaking of, that process of even submitting himself to interviews, that's a real vulnerability that's there. For Francis, his weakness is his strength. It's not surprising that we hear that in his prayer for the Year of Mercy. One of the lines is, "You will that your ministers would also be clothed in weakness, in order that they may feel compassion for those in ignorance and error." So that was the first lesson about leadership, and it's that humility, self-criticism, openness to improvement. Secondly would be that the secular commentators have noted is the apparent consistency of Francis's life with the values that he articulates. That gives him credibility. So if you're talking about humility, but it's a false humility, if it's a gimmick, that shows through. For us as Catholics, we understand that this is closely related to the year of mercy, that there has to be that lived experience of what it is that we say we believe. So a consistency of life with the values that we articulate. Thirdly, even though Pope Francis has a great mind that is obviously well-fed and tended, yet it's clear that he leads as much with his heart as with his head. Part of his examination of conscience for priests is the question, do you cry for your people? Do you passionately intercede for them with the Father? We have to look into our own hearts to see in our own leadership style to what extent we're involved in that way. But there's more. What the secular media doesn't seem to grasp is the extent to which Pope Francis's leadership is rooted in his relationship with Christ. That prayer, study, reflection on Christ and his priorities. In The Joy of the Gospel, he talks about how important it is that we all learn the language of the Gospels. Not in terms of Greek or Hebrew, but just the phraseology, so that we're able to speak convincingly. In The Joy of the Gospel, the Pope included a whole section on the subject of preparation for homilies, and it all revolves around prayerful reflection. That's not just for deacons or for priests preparing for homilies. That's good advice for all of us. As we're going about our work, our ministries, we must always make sure that they're rooted in the gospel. The determining priority for a leader shouldn't be convenience or finance or personnel issues. It has to be the gospel of mercy that has to prevail. If we're doing Christ's work of mercy, it's then that we are bound to succeed. Many have commented on Francis's hopefulness, his joy, in spite of having the weight of the world on his shoulders, evident from the moment that he stepped out on the balcony. You'll remember that moment. He had that deer in the headlights. Someone on the head went down. He asked us all to pray for him. And when he got up, there was a joy, and we've seen that in the years since then. And the joy, I suspect, for this leader comes from knowing that the work is Christ's, that we're his servants, that we're the laborers rather than the master builders. And in that comes a great freedom. I see that my time is up, so I'm going to cut this short. And I really thank you. I hope we'll have an opportunity to discuss, especially the leadership part, a little bit later. As I said, I know I'm not the expert in these things, but I hope I've given you at least a little bit for your own discussions, and I look forward to hearing about that later. Thank you.